Hello everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the Future of Work, co-hosted with the Institute for the Future of Work. Today we'll be discussing the central role that better, fairer work could play in both levelling up and building stronger, more resilient and healthy communities across the country. The Institute's Good Work Monitor, created with UCL and Opinion, is here to support the conversation, and we'll circulate that in the chat now for those that haven't seen it. I'm delighted to hand over now to Clive Lewis, Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group.
Thank you, Anna. First thing to say is we've got an absolute stellar cast of speakers for you today, and that we'll hopefully be able to tap into both their big brains and their practical experience in some cases. Now, we're going to need that, given that the COVID-19 pandemic has upended our world of work and amplified underlying inequalities in our society. And we've all seen firsthand the gulf widen between those in good work and those whose working lives are precarious and uncertain. As the IFOW's Good Work Monitor research shows, poor conditions for work and low availability of good work are closely related to poor health outcomes. Bad work has long been associated with disease and death and despair before the pandemic came along, but after COVID-19, that's morphed into many more mortalities as well. So here's how it's going to work today, in theory. Panelists will be invited to comment for 5 to 7 minutes on work, well-being and levelling up, with reference to at least one of these 3 key questions, which I'm going to read out now. What role does good work play in building strong, resilient communities across the country? Would a focus on building the conditions for good work reduce growing inequalities in work and health? And how can we best align health, social, and economic interests in recovery plans? So our first guest today needs little introduction. He's going to tackle one of those or 2 of those 3 questions and some other points as well. Our first guest is Andy Burnham, who was elected the Mayor of Greater Manchester in 2017 and has previously held ministerial positions at the Home Office, Department of Health and the Treasury. And in 2008, he became Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport before returning to Health as Secretary of State in 2009. Andy, you've got 5 to 7 minutes. I'll give you a minute's warning when your time's coming up, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Clive. It's a joy to join such a stellar and distinguished panel this afternoon, and thank you everyone else who's joined. This for me is exactly the conversation to be having as we turn our minds to building back fairer, greener, more equal from the COVID crisis. And that certainly was the title of Professor Sir Michael Marmot's work, looking at what has happened during the pandemic, and particularly how our poorest communities have been hit hardest. And I'll come back to that in a moment, Clive. But you mentioned my time as Secretary of State for Health. I was the recipient of Michael's original report on health inequalities in 2010. And he and I were together in February last year on the eve of the pandemic when the 10-year review was presented. And I can remember sitting in the audience, watching Michael kind of lay out how the quality of work had deteriorated massively between 2010 and 2020, both in terms of people's income levels, but also how we'd seen a cancer of insecurity spread through the workplace. And the thing about that is obviously it damages people's mental health as well as their physical health, in that people are living in a situation of high stress and anxiety, and also then left in a position where they can't necessarily protect their health because of their inability to stay away from work, even if they are physically unwell. And that was all laid out. And in many ways, I look back on that day when Michael presented his 10-year review as a sort of premonition of what was about to happen. You know, he presented to us that in the decade between 2010 and 2020, and I'm sure he'll say more today, life expectancy in the UK had stalled for the first time in 100 years, but it had gone backwards in parts of the north, and particularly amongst women in most deprived parts of the north. And I think that is very much linked to the growing casualisation of the workplace in some of our poorest communities. So the question is, what do we do about it, and what role, to answer your question, can good work play in building stronger, more resilient communities? Well, I think you do have to look, don't you, at what's happened over the last year. Why have we had stubbornly high levels of infection in certain parts of the UK? And if you look at the map, it is the poorest communities. Go back to the summer of 2020. After Leicester, the first kind of geography to go under local restrictions was Greater Manchester, East Lancashire and parts of West Yorkshire. And that geography mirrored almost exactly the geography of the government in which I served, the Housing Pathfinder scheme, a geography that is characterised by poor housing, but also low paid, insecure work. And those factors are lie behind why those areas have had stubbornly high levels of infection. We know, we've had it repeatedly played back to us, that there are people who haven't stayed at home all through the pandemic because their work doesn't make it possible, and who haven't been able to self-isolate when asked to do so, not just because of the financial impact, but because they fear not having a job at the end of the period of self-isolation, because they'd simply be sacked. And I think that if people weren't aware of it before, the map of how COVID has kind of taken hold of our country and some communities, it basically is a map of where work is poorest. And also it is linked, of course, to housing, because people then are going back to housing that is more crowded and where there are less opportunities to isolate safely. And I think in those two factors, you have the explanation as to why COVID has hit some communities hardest: poor work combined with poor housing. I'll just bring what I want to say, Clive, to a close. Would a focus on building the condition of good work reduce inequalities? Well, we're absolutely certain about that. If you don't have the foundation of a good, safe home and good work behind you, I do not see how you can have a good life, and I do not see how you can have good health. Because even in post-pandemic times, if you're worrying day to day about whether you will have a job and whether you will have enough money to pay the rent and feed the family, you don't have health. You in many ways have work that is damaging your health, your mental health on a daily basis. And that is the lived reality of millions of people in our country. But there's a concentration of people living a life like that in parts of the north. There's more people living life like that in the north than there is in other parts of the country. And I think if we think about the last year, people have lived parallel lives. There are some people who've never stayed at home, who've been working in risky workplaces all year, who haven't been able to self-isolate, as I say, compared to others who've been completely insulated at times because of their work and their financial circumstances. And this is the story of two countries, isn't it? That is there now, and it's clear for all. It's clear for all to see. So if we are to respond properly to this pandemic, we have to redefine levelling up. Levelling up can't be a concept that is to do with big infrastructure. It's got to start with the poorest people in our poorest communities and giving them the basic foundations of good homes and good jobs to therefore build the health and the resilience of those communities and give them a level of resilience that would give them a chance of fighting the next pandemic whenever it may come. In our case, we will be putting centre stage the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter coming out of the pandemic. This is something that we built from the bottom up with business and trade unions. It's a framework that has been adopted in the Liverpool City region. I think you're going to hear from Mayor Driscoll later, and I know that in the North East they're looking at something similar. We have taken the decision to link our Good Employment Charter to public procurement in Greater Manchester, driving the growth of good work from from the bottom up, using public procurement as a tool. That for us is a precondition for levelling up. You cannot level up communities on shattered foundations where people have not got jobs that allow them to have that basic quality of life. So that's where things are from our point of view, Clive. The pandemic has basically told in more stark and graphic terms the same story that Michael Marmot put before the country in February last year. The question now is, what do we do about it? And we think it's got to start with good jobs and good homes. So I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that. And rather than ask you any kind of direct questions now, I'm going to run through all of the guests, and then we're going to come back and have I'll ask some questions and we'll have a debate amongst ourselves and the other MPs and peers that are taking part. So our next guest is Dr. Jennifer Dixon. She's the CEO of the Health Foundation. Originally trained in medicine, Jennifer practiced mainly pediatric medicine prior to a career in policy analysis. Prior to working at the Health Foundation, Jennifer was Chief Executive of the Nuffield Trust from 2008 to 2013, Director of Policy at the King's Fund, and was the Policy Advisor to the Chief Executive of the National Health Service from 1998. Jennifer, that's a very impressive bio there, and I hand over to you now to go through those three questions that I articulated at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clive, for the opportunity, and also congratulations to on this report on good work and health, which I thought was a really excellent report, and also for the timeliness of this, because in the last week, of course, we've had the landmark ruling against Uber, against the casualisation of labour and the gig economy, and also yesterday's data from ONS on the number of jobless, which has edged up to 5.1%, still low, but nevertheless increased, and with the casualties largely being the young 18 to 24-year-olds. We wait to see what happens when furlough finishes. So just a couple of preambles and then 2 points. Preamble is, of course, there's a huge link between work and health, lots of evidence on that. A huge link between unemployment and health as well. We know a lot about that too. Work and health operates at many levels, particularly at the individual level. Unemployment is bad, poor quality work is bad, we know that. But also at a community level, as Andy said, if you don't have work, you don't have dignity, you don't have security of life, you can't raise a family. It injures the social fabric, we know that. So very, very critically important. Question then is, of course, how to increase employment, increase good employment, and how to make both more geographically equitably distributed is the question on the table. And I think the report talks about this with respect to, in the context of government strategy, with respect to levelling up and with respect to the post-Brexit and post-pandemic economic strategy, whatever that is. But it doesn't really talk about how you might improve work quality through other action, for example, through investor action on corporates, or indeed more direct corporate action, or indeed legal action, as was in the case of Uber. So those are other avenues to consider, as well as government policy. So just my 2 comments then that I would like to make. The first obvious one is on levelling up. And really, this is such a woolly concept, and enormous amounts of, really, it's just been tossed out in speeches, hasn't it? Tons of thinking now has to be done. There's no obvious centre in government thinking about levelling up. There needs to be. The term is ill-defined. It needs to be clarified. What's the unit of analysis? Is it regions? Is it cities? Is it communities? First, what is the thing to be levelled up? Is it GDP? Is it employment? Is it education? Is it health? Is it public spending, capital spend, transport, etc., etc.? What's the timescale? Is this about a short-term recovery after COVID, or is it something tackling longer-term structural economic deep-seated problems of the type that Andy mentioned that were still in place when he was developing his inequality strategy when he was Secretary of State for Health? And there's some evidence here that actually those areas that were crushed most by the COVID pandemic economically are not the same, actually, as those that have long-term structural economic problems, the left behind areas, if you like. So there's some issue there about where the focus of this is. The clarity also needs to, if you look at what the government has done, there is work on regeneration and levelling up. But there are many different funding programs with many different criteria spread across different departments. There isn't a joined up strategy. Neither is there an economic strategy to underpin all of this. And also flailing in the wind is what is the government's approach to local government policy now, to regional devolution? What is that? What's going to happen there in future? As well as the underlying theory of change to levelling up. If you act, what's the link between the action and the outcome, given we know we haven't been able to level up many areas or regenerate them as fully as we had wanted to do. So in short, I'm labouring this because there's a ton of work to do. And what's the last thing I would want to say on that is this level up agenda really about a pre-election sort of activity, or is it really longer term planning and structure for the country into the future? So I leave that there. That's my comment number one, and a quicker comment number two. So my world, a lot of it is in the NHS. The NHS is not only is the UK's largest industry, it's actually Europe's largest industry by far, with a £1.4 billion turnover, 1.4 million staff. It has a massive role in regeneration of a place, economic regeneration and inclusive growth in a place, as many people on this panel will know very well, Jamie and Andy in particular. And its role in regeneration as an anchor really could be developed far more full, both as a local anchor in a town, but also nationally as a huge central piece of our life and its heft in order to shape policy. So there's some action around on this, as you know, and we have yesterday launched, the Health Foundation launched with NHS England the NHS Anchor Network to give support to trusts that are trying to build and regenerate their areas. So there's a lot of work I think that the NHS could do that I think could be built upon. So my two initial comments therefore are levelling up, what is it, and more clarity needed across government, and secondly, a huge potential for the NHS, which is we're in the foothills of grasping. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And you've come in under time, which is fantastic, which leaves a bit more time for everyone else. So thank you very much. Next, we have Mayor Jamie Driscoll, who is the Mayor of the North of Tyne Combined Authority. And after leaving school at 16, Jamie returned to education as a mature student to gain an engineering degree at Northumbria University. He worked as an engineer making breathing apparatus and in the electronics and IT sector, later setting up his own software development firm. Before being elected to the office of Mayor, North of Tyne, Jamie was a Labour and cooperative councillor in the Monument Ward in Newcastle city centre. It doesn't say it in his bio, but I know he's a karate man as well. I don't know if that's relevant, but Jamie, give us your best chop, and you've got 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Cheers, Clive. Thank you very much. The big question about the future of work for many people is, will there be any after we emerge for lockdown? I mean, Andy's up for election in May. We've got the North of Tyne. We have an objective set by government to create 10,000 jobs over 30 years. Been in post for 20 years, for 20 months, should have created 583 jobs, around 3,194. We've safeguarded another 2,114, so we're doing well on that. But the key point here is we've embedded our good work pledge in every single contract and all of our procurement. And there are 5 pillars to our good work pledge that we work with the employers on. So number 1 is health and well-being has to be treated seriously in the workplace. And that includes provisions for mental health support, not just basic health and safety legislation. Point 2 is we have a balanced workforce, including the need for progression and the opportunity for people to develop so that they feel that their work is worthwhile. Point 3 is valuing and rewarding the workforce. So that includes paying the real living wage, not just the legal minimum wage. It means job security and end-to-end secure contracts, but also about fulfillment, that people are actually enjoying their work. Point 4 is genuine communication and representation. So that includes trade union representation. Employers who have trade union recognition agreements in place have more productive workplaces. These workplaces are more profitable. They have lower turnover of staff, lower absenteeism. And the 5th one is demonstrating social responsibility, because employment is part of the fabric of our society, as the IFOW report says. So why would any employer not want to do that? And also when it comes to Kickstart and scaling up, we've embedded that. So we've got employers who are signing up. We're a gateway organisation. Some of them are even topping up the Kickstart to real living wage levels. And I'm really proud of my team for the work they've done on this. I think leaders should praise their employees publicly. That's part of good work and being valued. And we do lead by example. The North of Tyne has a 0 gender pay gap. But all of this is against the backdrop of rising unemployment. 24% of people also are not paid the real living wage in the North East. In-work poverty is rife. It's about 72% of kids in poverty from working families. And there'll be another 24,000 jobs lost on top of all of this when furlough ends. So when we look at the figures in the Good Work Monitor report, the North of Tyne has an average of about 57th out of 118 against the social conditions of work where we're on average 97th out of 118. So we're punching up above our weight, but what's letting us down is the basic prosperity of the area. And this isn't a problem we can fix. It's not about tweaking levers where we carry on before and trying to mitigate the problems at the end of the process. There's no grand gesture or announcement that will fix this. We have to design it out. We have to look at the way the economy works, I think. And if we had a piece of work done, GDP per capita in the North East, way back in 1870 was 93% of the national average. And in 1981, it was 93% of the national average. And it's gone down and down and down, and we're now at 73% of the national average. And 93% I can live with. The capital city is always going to have a bit more economic activity than the Northeast, but not 73%. We can't live with that. We're dying. Our life expectancy is lower. Keir gave a speech the other day where he says, even the poorest parts of the Northeast, you will live for 5 years shorter than the poorer parts of London. The West End Food Bank, if you're going to have to go to a food bank to feed your family, what's that going to do for your confidence? What's that going to do for people's aspirations? What's that going to do for your health? Never mind the starvation aspects of it, the sheer cortisol of that stress is terrible. It's not going to do anything for your resilience. And Philip Alston, the United Nations Special Rapporteur, when he came to Newcastle, he said, abandoning people at the private market in relation to a service that affects every dimension of their basic well-being is incompatible with human rights requirements. So we have to intervene. In that time, since 1981, where GDP per capita has plummeted across the Northeast, there have been 51 initiatives by governments of both parties, well, 3 parties with a coalition in there, none of which have addressed that problem. 51 initiatives to local growth and increasing it. Levelling up will fail unless we restore that basic thing of we just need more money. And that money has to be addressed at its core. And it's not about transfers in necessarily. It's about generating wealth here, regional prosperity. It's iterative. EU funding is coming to an end. What's going to happen with the replacements for that through the Shared Prosperity Fund? Venture capital, 54% of it in this country goes to London, 3% comes to the Northeast. Business startups are low here. What we need is a regional wealth fund. We need a Green New Deal. These are the things that will enable us to create the jobs that we can then use the policy to create good jobs. But if there's no jobs there, it's not going to happen. So the conditions for good work are necessary, and the money coming into the region is that it's often public services used to treat the conditions. So we need to invest to save as well. We need to be tackling ill health. Andy spoke about poor housing. These are the things that we need to be changing. Because the nature of work is changing. Automation's coming. That's a good thing in many ways. You know, we have washing machines. I don't want to be washing clothes in the bath. But who will benefit from increasing automation? We need asset ownership. People who don't work but have private assets, private pensions, nice houses, they do a lot better than people who aren't working who don't have any assets. And we're going in the wrong direction on that. So bad work is about feeling powerless. It could be about your boss shouting at you, not being able to buy the things you see everybody else having around you, feeling you can't change your life, and then the feeling there's no point in voting because nobody listens to you. This is an endemic problem that affects so many things. So we worked with the Chamber of Commerce, the CBI, the Federation of Small Businesses to develop our Good Work Pledge. Good work is not just about an employment contract, it's about a social contract. Where's the other half of that? Because I can tell you now, the business leaders I was talking to this morning, they want this agenda. They're sick of being castigated because of the failures of poor employers. They're sick of competing with people on an unlevel playing field. Good employers want the state to reward employers who create good work.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and a very profound point to end on. Thank you, and thank you for keeping to time as well. Our next speaker is Professor Patricia Findlay. She's a leading expert in work and employment relations and a director of the Scottish Centre for Employment Research at the University of Strathclyde. Since 2017, Professor Findlay has been co-chair of the Scottish Fair Work Convention and has worked in a number of government advisory roles, notably as chair of research and analysis for the Women's Employment Summit. Patricia, your 5 to 7 minutes begins now. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. I'm coming to this issue today as an academic, and maybe slightly differently from some of the other panel members, as an academic with a long-term interest in job quality and how we might innovate in order to deliver it. And also, as Clive said, in my co-chair role of Scotland's Independent Fair Work Convention. The obvious place for me to start is by agreeing, I suppose, with everything that has been said already, and stressing the importance of good work and fair work in delivering strong, resilient communities. And I want to stress that it doesn't really matter what term we use: decent work, better work, good work. In Scotland, we use fair work. The quality of work matters a great deal to all of us. It matters most obviously to the people who are in work or trying to access it, because it impacts not just on their health and well-being, crucially, but it impacts on their chances of being poor. It impacts on the opportunity to derive any meaning from your work, and it impacts on your ability to stay in work towards a reasonable retirement age. We know that work, from a huge swathe of research, that work can provide a huge range of meaning in your life, as well as delivering the material foundations of a successful life. But for many people, it doesn't do that. And even prior to the pandemic, even when employment levels were high for many people, it still was not doing that. We also know that different demographic groups are more likely to be in poor quality work in the first place and to be trapped in it. It's not a transitional job that they do for a short time, they're trapped in it for a long time. And we know that poor quality work is concentrated in particular sectors and geographies, and therefore creates wider community problems. So we know what matters to individuals. It should matter, however, much more strongly to employers and to citizens. We know it does matter to some employers. But employers have an interest in good work. They have an interest in avoiding the costs of poor work, whether that be poor retention, poor turnover, losing investment in training costs, poorer quality or customer service. But perhaps more significantly, employers miss out on the opportunity cost of good work, because they miss out on the work engagement, the discretionary behaviour, the performance, the effort, the innovation that high quality work is much more likely to deliver. As citizens, we should also be very concerned about what poor quality work means for our national economic performance. What do low value business models based on poor quality work do to productivity and competitiveness? What does it mean for the fact that we educate lots of people, but we don't utilise them well in our workplaces? And how does that contribute to the UK's productivity puzzle? But we should also be concerned about the externalities of poor work, because they are paid for by everyone. The externalities of poor work mean that low pay constrains tax revenues. It requires topping up through the welfare system. Poor health conditions need to be addressed in the healthcare system. The constraints on social mobility are a cost to us all. And poor work creates and perpetuates gender inequalities in workplaces in the labour market. All of that spills over into the experiences of our families and communities. So to answer the question that we were asked, would a focus on building the conditions for good work reduce inequalities in work and health? Well, the answer to that is yes, it could and it should. But I think the point I would want to stress is that won't happen by chance. It won't happen randomly. It didn't happen when we had high employment levels. We have to remember, I think, that beyond the parameters of existing employment and health and safety legislation, the provision of good work is the direct responsibility of employers, not policymakers. It's employers who decide who occupies a job, who gets a job. It's employers who decide what type of contracts are offered, what and how people are paid. It's employers who decide who gets training or who doesn't get it, whose careers develop and whose careers stagnate. And of fundamental importance, who participates in decision-making at work and who doesn't. And that's a really important part I'm going to return to. So of course, these aren't free choices. Employers face a whole series of constraints in product markets, labour markets, institutional regulatory constraints. But some businesses make very, very distinct choices, even though those are bounded choices within the same product markets. And the choices that businesses make have huge significance when it comes to the quality of work and all of the consequences of that. So it seems to me we have two key challenges. One is to understand and engage with employers and how they deliver good work. And that's not the same as saying we should leave this to employers' voluntary efforts. But secondly, to consider who else can influence how employers make decisions, and what levers could they bring to that conversation. And I think that's where there's a key role for government and for policymakers in addressing how collectively we can reshape work to produce that alignment between health, social and economic interests, especially as we move through and beyond the pandemic. I'm just going to talk very briefly about Scotland's Fair Work agenda here. Let me say quickly, this is neither a political, nor a constitutional, nor a public relations point. The Scotland's Fair Work Convention is independent of government. And I want to talk about it because I think it gives us some pointers alongside some of the other things that have been mentioned about how we might leverage activity in this space. What are the key issues and key challenges? So we define fair work from the Convention's point of view as work that offers effective voice, opportunity, security, fulfilment and respect. Work that balances the rights and responsibilities of employers and workers, and work that generates benefits for all. So explicitly and by design, we've aligned individual well-being with broader economic and social interests in our drive towards fair work. How do we go about trying to do this? Well, we've got two roles. The first is that we act as advisors to the Scottish Government on fair work, and the second is that we advocate for it. On that first point of advising Scottish Government, if you take one thing away from anything I say today, it is that if you are genuinely serious about a commitment to drive good work, it has to, support for it has to be embedded in the architecture of government and of policymaking. It has to be something that's deep-seated in what government does. We've worked very hard to ensure that fair work isn't a niche agenda, but that it's a thread across very different policy areas, including business support, skills policy, as people have already said, procurement practices that emphasise fair work conditionality, working with public bodies and agencies to make sure that fair work is embedded in their service provisions and their offers, and through a range of policies and initiatives that engage with, encourage and support businesses to develop fair work. We've also placed a very strong emphasis on measurement, developed a measurement framework and argued successfully for key fair work indicators to be part of the National Performance Framework, so that progress or the lack of progress is visible to all. Turning to that second role, that advocacy role, we work collaboratively across all relevant stakeholders, employers, trade unions, employers' organisations, public agencies, government at all level, regulatory agencies and so on, civic society organisations, because there are real challenges in delivering fair work and it has to be discussed and better understood. We need stakeholder voices, we need dialogue, we need constructive cross-stakeholder relationships because we need to improve the knowledge and evidence at our disposal. Crucially, we need the voice of those who experience poor quality work in order to address it. And that's a real challenge in the UK because our data and our practice on effective worker voice is poor. And that's problematic for a good or a fair work agenda anywhere across the UK. We also advocate widely that people should share in the direct and indirect benefits of fair work. So if fair work creates better business performance or drives innovation, the benefits of that improved performance should be shared. We don't and we can't claim spectacular progress at this stage. Understanding what drives and improves fair work outcomes is really complex and challenging. Although a recent report has shown some areas where there have been gains in terms of fair work measures, some that have been stubbornly resistant to change, and some that have gotten worse. And all of that data was collected prior to COVID, so that will have had a huge impact. One of the things we have seen, however, which is important, is we've seen that the embeddedness of fair work over the last few years has shaped the Scottish Government's pandemic response, for example, through tripartite processes for restart and return to work, and a continued emphasis on the key role of fair work as a driver of economic recovery. Just to finish off, in some senses, the pandemic has thrown deep-seated problems in the labour market and in workplaces into much sharper focus. I do not doubt that occupation is and will be shown to be one of the key drivers of how people fare during and beyond this pandemic. So focusing on the quality of work now is ever more pressing as we grapple with some of these fundamental shifts in business and the economy. It would be a huge step back and a huge mistake. Of course, we have to rely on the importance of providing employment, but we still have to maintain that good employment agenda, that fair work agenda. If we don't do that, we will live with the choices that employers and policymakers make in this regard for many years to come. So given all of that, let me conclude by urging all of those who have influence, all of those concerned, to make decisions that prioritise good and fair work, because those are the decisions that will benefit us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia Findlay. Professor Findlay, I can say now that there's a lot of questions that are coming in off the back of all of you speaking, so it's looking really good for the next section. Before we go to that, if I can now introduce Professor Sir Michael Marmot, if I do need to introduce him, but I will introduce him nonetheless. Professor Michael Marmot, Sir Professor Michael Marmot is the Professor of Epidemiology at University College London and past President of the World Medical Association. Professor Marmot has led research groups on health inequalities for over 40 years. He was chair of the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, which was set up by the World Health Organization in 2005. At the request of the British government, he conducted the strategic review of health inequalities in England, which Andy Burnham mentioned earlier, was on his watch as a health secretary. And that published its report, Fair Society, Healthy Lives, in February 2010. In February 2020, he launched the Marmot Review, 10 years on, a report on the health inequalities across England. So Michael, please, if you would, if we could hear from you now for the next 5 to 7 minutes, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clive. It won't come as a surprise that I agree with the way Andy began his intervention, talking about the report that I produced in February last year. And it's highly relevant because, as I said in my Build Back Fairer report, which I produced in December, we do not want to go back to the status quo. The status quo in February was marked by a failure of life expectancy to continue to improve, increased inequalities in health, and as Andy said, the poorest people outside London, health getting worse. Miserable. And if you accept my proposition that health tells us something fundamental about the nature of society, it means if health stopped improving, society stopped improving. If inequalities in health continued, inequalities in society increased. And if health for the worst off was declining, their conditions of life were declining. We have to address this, and work is part of it. And we know a lot about the nature of work. A few years ago, I interviewed an employee in an Amazon warehouse. And as I listened to him describe the conditions of his work, I thought, he's just told me everything we've been studying about the psychosocial characteristics of work. High demand, low control, effort-reward imbalance, organizational injustice, shift work, heavy lifting, and job insecurity. It was as if they'd taken a big syringe, put everything we knew about the damaging effects of work and injected him with it. It won't have escaped your notice that Jeff Bezos's personal wealth increased dramatically during the pandemic as Amazon prospered. Jennifer, forgive me, but the statistic I mentioned yesterday, that between March 2020 and December 2020, the wealth of America's 651 billionaires increased by $1 trillion, $1,000 billion, 651 billionaires. Those billionaires could write a check for $3,000 for each of the 330 million Americans and have the same wealth that they had when the pandemic began. So I know what it's like to work in an Amazon warehouse, and their wealth is increasing, of these Jeff Bezos and his fellow billionaires, out of all proportion. That model is broken. The model in the US that began with Reagan has come to an end. I would say Trump is the last slap of the dinosaur's tail. And a similar model in Britain that began at the same time. I can't remember the name of the Prime Minister. The same time, I'm joking. I do remember in 1979. The same model, that model is unsustainable. We can't have billionaires increasing their wealth at that rate. I was taking part in a program, as somebody from the Institute of Economic Affairs said, build on the green belt. The solution of every problem in Britain is to build on the green belt. The model is broken. We need change at national level. I'm delighted that we're working with Greater Manchester under Andy's leadership. We're listening to Jamie Driscoll and thinking, we've been working with Gateshead. I think we should be working with the north of Tyne as well as the other side of the Tyne. And in fact, because of the work that we're doing with Andy and his colleagues in Greater Manchester, Cheshire and Merseyside approached us and said, could we work with them? So we do need action at national level, no question, but we also need action at regional, city, local level, absolutely vital. But we need to be thinking about work in a different way. I go back to the essay by Keynes about the economic prospect for our grandchildren. He thought that we'd only need to work 5 hours a day by now, that our income would have increased sixfold. It did. He was right about that. But we'd only need to work 5 hours a day. We need to be thinking about a different model. I floated in my Build Back Fair report, why aren't we talking about the 4-day week? And why is it just the 4-day week? What is the place of work in society? And Jamie, exactly what you said about work as disempowering. It needs to be empowering, but it's currently disempowering. Those characteristics I described of imbalance between demand and control, effort-reward imbalance, low organizational justice, shift work, heavy lifting, those in a way are emblematic of what it means to be lower down in society. All that effort for little reward, little control over your life, despite the demands on you, perceived injustice. This is extremely damaging to people's health. And we should be able to solve this. We know what good work looks like. People like Patricia and the colleagues that I've been working with about the nature of the work environment, we know what good work looks like. And I think we kind of know the steps we've got to take to get there. The history of public health tells us that voluntary agreements are not enough. We do need to put structures in place. We do need regulations. But it's not necessarily the case that it's good working conditions or good profits. We need to try and impress on employers that good work can actually be good for their business. I've heard people, Muhammad Yunus, talking about social business, and it led me to think, at the end of the day, if you looked back, if you were an employer and you look back on your day's work and you said, here's two possibilities. One is, wow, I really made a mess of that guy and I got profit at his expense. Aren't I a good boy? What a good day that was. As distinct from, wow, I provided employment for people and improved their working conditions and gave them a commitment to society. Which would most people prefer? The idea that we're all driven by this bottom line of profits and that's it, I think is a model that needs to be questioned. So work is fundamental to society, and it's fundamental to thinking about the kind of society we want, which is why I called my report Build Back Fairer, and it will take commitment at national, regional, and local level.
Thank you very much, Sir Michael, and very, 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 very good. Can can I just ask the panelists just to say that I'm going to ask a few questions here, and we were going to separate this out between peers and MPs and then the wider panel, but because of time, I think what we're going to do is we're going to bulk them on together. So I'm going to pick out 4 questions. We've had an absolute avalanche of questions, and there's some very good ones in there which we don't have time to ask, but I'm going to pick out 4, and then you can choose from them the ones that you'd like to answer. Some of them are specific to you, and some of them are general. But I think the first one I'd like to ask is one that I wear a different hat from a different APPG, which is on the Green New Deal. And the question is, what is the role of the Green New Deal in all of this? And how do we integrate good work and the Green New Deal? Is that something that needs to happen? That's one question. The other question is one to the mayors, and that's what powers do you need? What extra powers, extra levers do you need to be able to enable, to enforce, to regulate good and better working conditions and well-being? So if you could answer that one. I've got 2 more. What's the panel's view of the role that the state should play in encouraging and incentivizing good work? And the final one is this one here. Just give me a second. Social care is a good example of where we need to rethink good work. Challenges are enabling good work in the context of a market driven by commissioners needing to get the best price versus care, and that's being a key drive for skills and growth in communities. So how can we change this? So how do we bring in the issue of social care into this? So if we could start with Jennifer, if you'd like to come in here and start on that, and then if you all like to just kind of come in as you see fit.
Thank you, Clive. In fact, there was a cluster of questions one about social care. There's also about the NHS's role. And
yes, please.
I think these 2 systems, one national, one rather fragmented and local, are clearly very important because they are one of the biggest growth industries that we're going to have over the next 10, 25 years. Not only are they one of the biggest growth industries, but they also take in staff who are amongst the most vulnerable, particularly those who are not college educated, which we know from US and UK data is a particular issue for health and work. So I think they have enormous potential to soak up. It's going to have to happen anyway because of demand on the system. So these organisations, well, the NHS and how social care is ultimately organised, will have to be have an opportunity to be a good model employers. And I think onto the specific social care question, where there are enormous shortages at the moment, a lot of staff on 0-wage contracts and on minimum wage. This is an area where clearly extra investment, as Jamie was saying earlier, is just the obvious answer, as well as how local authorities use their commissioning power in contracting. And I'm sure Patricia has something to say about that too. So I think this is a real growth area. It's a real opportunity area for the kinds of, for mopping up some of the unemployment that is going to exist in the future, because caring is going to be needed. But the other point, just quickly on the NHS, is that it's not just that the NHS is going to become we're going to become a giant hospital in this country with more and more public spending being soaked up by the NHS. It's that the NHS is not a drain. It can also generate wealth through the kinds of inclusive growth opportunities that Jamie and Andy particularly will be familiar with, in the way that it can work with business, with local authorities, with universities on the science R&D agenda to generate innovation and wealth as part of the industrial strategy. So I think there's a huge role there, and that's what I was referring to. Not that the NHS becomes a massive job centre and hands out jobs or benefits, but actually it can generate growth, and in a way that hasn't really been exploited enough, I think, in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Andy, would you like to come in next?
I mean, I think the contribution has been fantastic, by the way. Really enjoyed what Michael was particularly saying. I mean, what role for the state? I think it's about work, but it's about more than work, Clive, is what I would say. And I just want to reference the work we've done on homelessness in Greater Manchester. what I see is often the state is causing the problem by the rules it kind of creates around support for people. So obviously we've got lots of people in work, but in work and on benefit and using food banks that Jamie referred to. I mean, a lot of people in the food bank in the West End of Newcastle will be on in-work benefits of one kind or another. And there's a sort of tyranny of bureaucracy that the state creates around people that almost kind of makes life harder and sets them up to fail. And our work on homelessness, I think, has given us a bit of an insight into this, in that if you lift people out of that, you actually empower them. Michael talked about the disempowering effect of work. I think the system has a disempowering effect on people as well when you combine their work with their interaction with the state in the benefit system or with their landlord or in other ways. And the kind of learning point for me with our Housing First scheme, where we've got a pilot running, where people are given a home without strings, basically. It's the breathing space to recover is what matters. And people, without the cliff edge in front of them about a deadline by which they have to do something, they are able, that creates stress and it creates failure. And it's when you lift people out of that, you create the conditions for success and empowerment. And I think this is what the state has to understand. When Michael's calling for change at national level, I think this is what has to change. We have to have a different way of thinking about how we support people, not just in work, but in their life and in the basics of life. And I have come round to the view that some form of a universal basic income that combines secure housing, so secure work and secure housing, because obviously if you're secure about your work, you are then more secure about your housing because you know you'll be able to pay the rent. At the moment, people have the toxic combination of insecure work and insecure housing because of the way the private rented sector works. For me, that is what would deliver the foundation beneath people to enable them to have good health and a good life. And without it, I can't see how we can make this system, this race to the bottom system, work for people. So that's where my thinking has gone, Clive. Our Housing First scheme has a 90% success rate of people sustaining their tenancies. And I am certain it's because they are lifted out of the tyranny of the benefits system. And I think if we were to think about a universal basic income as a partnership with the private sector, I think we would spend public money in a very different way, truly on prevention, and not spending public money on crisis, pick up the pieces interventions, which we do, and we spend a huge amount of money in that way. And I think that is the role of the state here. Levelling up should mean putting firm, Jennifer rightly said, what does it mean, and raised all the concerns about it. It should mean, as a first stage of levelling up, before you get to regional inequalities, every citizen of this country has the foundations beneath them that give them the chance of building a decent life and having good health. At the moment, that isn't the case in far too many of our communities. People are being disempowered by their work, by the benefit system, by all of the environmental factors around them. And until that changes, I don't think we will get the fairer, the Build Back Fairer agenda that Michael talks about.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for that. Patricia Findlay, would you like to come in next on one of those points?
I'll come in quickly on the social care point, which Jennifer raised. It seems to me that the commissioning system for social care in the UK is largely broken and can't deliver good and fair work. That's not to say that that work is not fulfilling and meaningful in many respects, but it places an enormous burden on a largely female workforce. And that's largely produced by the way in which commissioning takes place. Interestingly, in the context of health and social care integration, you would see very few equivalents in the National Health Service to jobs that exist in social care. So you wouldn't see people on a 4-hour contract who might work 16 hours one week, 35 the next week, and 4 hours the following week. So there's something very broken about the social care system in terms of how it's funded and how it's operated, and that really does need to be addressed. And it's something that's we've written a report on relatively recently that's just been endorsed by an independent review of social care in Scotland. I think that takes us, I suppose, to the discussion of what the state can do. I made a very strong point about employers having key decision-making powers here, and they do, because they design all of the jobs that Michael talked about as having low autonomy, little support, too many demands. but the state creates the conditions in which businesses are allowed and entitled to operate. And so we do need to be thinking very seriously about whether our employment law framework is fit for purpose. We need to be thinking very seriously about what our minimum floors look like and whether they're producing the outcomes that we wanted from them. We need to be thinking very seriously about corporate governance. Maximising shareholder value will not be consistent with fair work in lots of circumstances, and a discussion about corporate governance, about what the role of corporations is, not to produce the outcomes, which Michael talked about earlier, but actually to support society, to create value and to distribute wealth. So corporate governance for me would be a big area of focus. And I would say one last thing. We really lack at all levels of the economy and society in the UK some of the institutions that are embedded in other countries where people have a voice. So we lack the social partnership institutions where different interests can come together, take ownership of employability programmes or welfare benefits, or take ownership of sector strategies. We lack that institutional embeddedness, and what happens is that we leave open in the framework that we have a race to the bottom, and sadly some businesses take that on.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I'm going to come to you next, Jamie. Andy's already mentioned that he's become an advocate for UBI in terms of giving people the security that they need for better work, well-being. What policy driver would you say, aside from that, a local level, a strategic authority level, you could use as a mayor to be able to drive this process?
Yeah, so in the business of, we've got to deliver this at some point. The reality is that Britain is actually a massive country. Geographically, we're not, but we've got a fairly large population, certainly on a European scale, a very large economy. And it's often run as a sort of a one-size-fits-all policy framework with a national industrial strategy, but nothing locally or regionally, certainly in England anyway. And then you add on to that, you've got departmental silos, where often you have almost competing agendas or whether or not joining up. So the number one thing would be to look at wealth generation and letting, whether it's mayors, whatever model you want. We've got metro mayors, it's a model that works. Let's just stick with that for now. The power to regenerate your economy. Then you can do things like embedding the Good Work Pledge in your procurement. You can do it in other things. So if I had 500 million quid, base rate at the moment is 0.1%. I know that I could create 14,000 jobs by investing in SMEs, because the economic landscape in the Northeast is very different from London. If you want to set up a business here, you're not going to get the capital. It's very, very difficult. So we can do that. And then it repays itself. So actually, it's not really costing the state anything. And you get the payroll taxes and everything else. These are things that need not break the bank, regardless of your views on modern monetary theory. So these are ways through. We should have wealth generation powers like land value uplift. We should have the ability to actually steer the direction of it. So the Green New Deal, we have a housing crisis. We know we have, and yet we talk about for years and years we've never built as many houses as we need. And yet, realistically, the model for local authorities to build houses is handicapped because of the nature of the right to buy. So rather than the Eat Out to Help Out scheme last July, I don't believe it's going to happen, but I'd love it if Rishi on Tuesday next says, right, there you go, Andy, there you go, Jamie, there's the money, build me 5,000 houses and make sure that you pay back the money for it. Whether that's you let them out as council houses, whether you sell them. These are the ways we can regenerate it. And by the way, make them greenhouses, not greenhouses, you know what I mean? At the same time, let's set up a way so that we can insulate all these houses that have that leaking heat and causing people a fortune, causing environmental damage and causing ill health. We can do this. It works. And the other side of it, I think, just to answer one of the other questions, what should the role of the state be in good work? It's no accident that we've seen the deregulation of employment leading to poorer and poorer work outcomes, more and more work insecurity. Exactly instead, as we've seen increasing regulation on trade unions to the point where trade unions find it very difficult to do anything at all these days. So I honestly think that I would love it if my party said, actually, we will accept that trade unions are a very good thing for society and we're going to let them do their job.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you very much for that. So Michael Marmot, one of the things that I think you began to tease out was that by focusing on fair work, we can explicitly align both health and social interests. Do you want to kind of tease out in some of the questions that have been asked and that point that you've consistently made?
Well, and it also relates to your first question about a Green New Deal. We don't, whatever you call it, we don't have any alternative. We have to deal with the inequalities, and work is a big part of it, and we have to deal with the climate crisis. And my Institute of Health Equity looked at this last year. I was approached by the government's Climate Change Committee to ask the question, can actions you would take to improve health contribute to net zero greenhouse gas emissions? Because they asked me to do it, I made it not just health, but health equity. And I had two clear messages, I hope. One was, there's no question that actions we take to improve health equity can contribute to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And the other clear message was, make equity absolutely vital to everything you do. So, for example, a green tax is a wonderful tax. Economists will tell you how terrific it is. But as a consumption tax, it has the real possibility to be regressive. We need to take that into account. If something you're going to do to improve the environment is regressive, then you've got to think of another way to be doing it. So you've got to take equity into account while you're dealing with the climate crisis. Absolutely vital. And it relates, and I noticed there was a question in the chat about automation, which of course is a perennial question, and it leads to the nature of work. And I wanted to come in on care workers because it's a prime example. More than 50% of workers in adult social care do not earn a living wage. What are we doing? What are we doing? In my reports, I've been saying, if you look at early childhood, we ought to adopt what they do in Finland. Workers with young children in Finland have master's degrees. They have a profession. We don't just give them our children over to people who'd like to earn a bit of money, having a few kids in the house or whatever. They're trained, it's a profession. And that's what we should do with early childhood. What about older people? I've got a vested interest in this. I'd like older people to be treated with the same dignity and the same care as everyone else in society. So the people who work with, I mean, these are heroes, mainly heroines, changing old people's nappies, changing their dressings, making them a cup of tea, recognizing if they need more serious problems. This should be a profession. It should be properly paid. All the things that Jamie talked about, his 5 pillars, which I love, by the way, Jamie, thank you. All the things that Jamie talked about with his 5 pillars, that should be true for workers in adult social care who play such a vital role in society. And we could go across all the important functions of society in the service sector and say that should apply to all of them. We still will need productive capacity in the economy, no doubt about it. But then we need to be thinking, if machines can do some of this work, that's why I started with Keynes. We won't need to work 5 days a week to get the same productivity. But we do need to think about distribution. And that's why I said, I think the model is broken. The idea that the billionaires, those billionaires, they now have $4 trillion. That's twice the wealth of the bottom half of the US population. I mean, it's just an unsustainable model. And we've got to think of a better way of distributing what society produces. So, and work and reimbursement for good work is a key part of that. But think about the social function that these vital people do.
Michael, thank you. That's a good note to end on. We've only gone a little bit over time. I wanted to thank all of you for your contributions today. I know I've learned a lot, and I think the APPG will have as well. Patricia, Andy, Jennifer, Jamie, Sir Michael, I hope that we are able to call on you at any time in the future and ask questions and follow up further on the points you've made and the research and the work and the experience that you've shown here today, if that's possible, because I'm sure we will be knocking at your door in the future. I just wanted to make a few kind of summation. I've been making notes, furiously trying to steer some of the questions and also make a few notes on some of the things that I took away from today. And I think there was a consensus. I think that one of the key things for me is that any approach on this issue has to be holistic. The current model of employment and the economy that we currently have is unsustainable, ecologically, economically. The pandemic has only exacerbated that fact and highlighted it all the more. And that we need actually a different way of thinking about work and the economy in general, where health and well-being is taken seriously in the workplace and it's integral to all that we do and at the center of the economy. It needs to encourage businesses to develop these changes, but that it can't be left to employers alone, and that there needs to be a level playing field of regulation and enforcement to stop unscrupulous employers undercutting scrupulous employers. That it needs to be integral to central government and government policy at both a national and a local level. Now that inevitably means giving more and specific powers to local authorities and combined authorities to drive this good work agenda. And I think one of the other things that came out was that any of the benefits, any of the gains made by better and fairer work measures should be equally shared and distributed between employers and employees. And I'll finally say, from being a co-chair of the Green New Deal group, it's really clear to me that ultimately our health, our jobs, the climate are all interlinked, and that any meaningful change will ultimately address all of those issues. So I thank you all for your contributions today in the ongoing debate. We have a massive opportunity in terms of the budget that is coming up, where we will see how seriously the government takes these issues and how they want to build back better and fairer in the future. So I thank you for your contributions today, and let's keep our fingers crossed for next week. Although I'm not going to hold my breath for too long, but let's keep optimistic as we were discussing before this started. So thank you all, and I would say safe journey normally, but happy days on switching this off at the end of this conversation. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you all.